Delaware, the forgotten name that started it all. Before America had a name, before freedom had a flag, before the first shot of revolution shattered silence. There was Delaware, the very first state to join the Union. The beginning of the American story. But here's what no one tells you. It was named after an English baron, a man who never even set foot on the land that now bears his name. His title stretched across rivers, forests, and centuries, not because he earned it, but because empires have always written their legacy in ink before blood. Delaware wasn't born from its people. It was stamped with a name from across the ocean. So who was this baron? Why did his name claim a river, a colony, and eventually, an entire state? And how did the first state of a free republic end up carrying the ghost of colonial nobility? To answer that, we need to go back. Back to a collapsing colony. Back to a nobleman with power, far from the chaos. Back to the moment when one name changed everything. This is the story of Thomas West, the third Baron Delaware. A name older than the nation. Long before Delaware became the first to sign the Constitution, it was nothing more than wild coastline, forests dense with mystery, rivers teeming with life, and a native people who called it home for thousands of years. They were the Lenape. To them, this land wasn't Delaware, it was Lenapehoking, the land of the people. Sacred, living, and free. But across the ocean, in England, the New World was little more than a prize. A distant place to be claimed, exploited, and named. And at the center of that ambition stood a man, Thomas West, the third Baron Delaware. He was no explorer, no adventurer. He governed from a distance, an English noble with ties to the powerful Virginia Company, investors who had bankrolled the colonization of America. In 1610, Jamestown was dying, disease, starvation, conflict. The colony teetered on the edge of collapse. And then came orders, from across the sea. Thomas West was appointed governor for life of Virginia. He sailed to the New World to restore order, with soldiers, supplies, and the crown's authority. He stayed only a short time, but his name, Delaware, remained. It would be passed from ship logs to maps, from riverbanks to colonies. And eventually, to a territory still hundreds of miles north, a place that had never seen his face. Never heard his voice. But would forever carry his name. The man behind the name, Thomas West, was born into privilege in 1577, an English noble from a powerful family, groomed for duty and influence. By title, he was the third Baron Delaware, but to those in court, he was a man of loyalty and order. To those who would cross him, he was authority. He never imagined his name would live on halfway across the world. In England, West held a seat in the House of Lords. But across the Atlantic, a desperate colony was on the brink of extinction. Jamestown, the first English settlement in America, had become a graveyard. Harsh winters, failed crops, and violent clashes with the indigenous Powhatan people had left the colonists starving and broken. It was 1610. The Virginia Company, desperate to protect its investment, turned to West. They gave him the title of governor for life and sent him to restore the colony, not with diplomacy, but with discipline. He arrived with 3 ships, 150 men, weapons, and the authority of the crown. And when he reached the Chesapeake Bay, he found what little remained of Jamestown ready to give up. The settlers were preparing to abandon everything and return to England. West stopped them. He reversed their retreat, ordered the rebuilding of the fort, and reimposed military rule. He demanded obedience. He brought structure. And in the eyes of the company, he brought salvation. But that salvation came at a cost. West viewed the indigenous tribes not as neighbors, but as threats. His leadership marked the beginning of increasingly violent raids and retribution against the Powhatan people. Peace was no longer the objective. Control was. Despite his brief stay, less than a year, West left his mark. He returned to England due to illness, never to see Virginia again. But his influence lingered. The English remembered the man who turned a dying outpost into a foothold of empire. And for that, they honored him the only way colonial powers knew how. They wrote his name onto the map. First, it was the bay. Then the river. then the territory north of the Virginia colony. Explorers, traders, and soldiers would refer to it all as belonging to Lord Delaware. Over time, the name changed. Spelled phonetically by cartographers, slurred by sailors and softened by time, Delaware became Delaware. And just like that, a nobleman's title, meant to command respect in an English court, was stamped across a continent he barely knew. But what the maps never show is what came before. The rivers that now bear his name already had names. The forests he never saw were already spoken for. The land that now honors a foreign baron was not empty, waiting to be claimed. It was alive. It was inhabited. It was indigenous. And while Lord Delaware's name stretched across the New World, it did so at the erasure of another. Because before there was Delaware, there was Lenapehoking. Indigenous lands, English titles, long before the first English ships appeared on the horizon, the land we now call Delaware was home to the Lenape. They lived in harmony with the rivers, forests, and coastline for thousands of years, long before maps, flags, or borders. To them, the Delaware River wasn't a discovery, it was a lifeline. It fed their villages, guided their travels, shaped their stories, and connected their people. They called it Lenapehoking, the river of the Lenape. Their land wasn't carved by rulers or governors. It didn't need titles to have meaning. It was known through memory, through language, through generations of care. Every stretch of water, every tree-lined ridge had a name, a purpose, a spirit. But then came the maps. The first English explorers didn't ask what these places were called. They didn't learn the language or preserve the stories. Instead, they named everything as if it had never existed before. A river, once sacred, became a tribute to Lord Delaware. A shoreline, once full of canoes and smoke from Lenape hearts, was renamed after English kings and sponsors. To the colonists, naming was power. If they could name it, they could claim it. To them, a name meant ownership, control, legacy. And so, with every new map, indigenous identity was slowly erased, not by swords, but by ink. The Lenape were pushed out, their presence reduced to footnotes in colonial journals. Their language, once spoken across the region, was silenced in favor of English. Their villages, once thriving, were replaced with settlements and forts bearing foreign titles. By the early 1600s, the name, Delaware, wasn't just on a river, it had begun to define the entire region. It didn't matter that Lord Delaware had never walked these trails. That he'd never seen the cliffs or smelled the cedar groves. His name, assigned by foreign powers, now replaced thousands of years of heritage. This wasn't just a renaming, it was a rewriting. It was how an empire made itself feel at home in a place that wasn't theirs. It's easy to forget that names carry weight. That behind each one is a decision, a story told, and another left untold. The word, Delaware, rolls off the tongue easily now. It's printed on signs, stitched into flags, engraved in courthouses. But beneath its surface lies something older, deeper, and often ignored. Because while the river flows the same way it always has, the name it carries now speaks of conquest, not connection. Still, the Lenape endure. Though pushed westward and scattered by centuries of forced migration, their descendants continue to keep their language, stories, and traditions alive. They remember what this land was called before the arrival of Lord Delaware. And some are working to return those names to the places that once held them. But history doesn't reverse easily. And as the name Delaware spread from the river to the surrounding lands, its colonial imprint deepened, becoming more than just a name on a map. It became a colony. From river to colony, the name Delaware first touched water. It began with the river, Lenapehoking to the Lenape, but gradually rebranded by English explorers as the Delaware River, in honor of Lord Delaware. Not because he had seen it. Not because he understood it, but because his name carried weight in London. And from there, the name spread like a tide. As more Europeans arrived, Dutch, Swedish, and eventually the English, they all saw the same thing: fertile land, strategic access to the Atlantic, and a powerful river that split the coastline like a lifeline. The river wasn't just water anymore, it became a marker of control, of territory. The Dutch called it Zuid Rivier, the South River. The Swedes built small outposts along its banks. But the English were determined to dominate, and as they tightened their grip, the name, Delaware, hardened into permanence. By the mid-1600s, the area surrounding the river began to take on the name itself. Settlements formed, some forced into existence through displacement and violence. Colonists claimed land that had already been lived on, farmed, and honored for generations. And still, they called it Delaware. By the late 1600s, the territory once part of Pennsylvania's proprietary charter was split off into what became known as the three lower counties. They shared a governor with Pennsylvania but maintained a separate assembly. It was an uneasy partnership, and one that would fracture as tensions with the British Crown grew. But before revolution was even a thought, the region was already becoming its own entity, one with its own needs, its own laws, and its own identity. Still, it kept the name. And so, Delaware transformed from a river to a region, from a name on a waterway to the name of a people's new reality. A colony built atop centuries of indigenous life, now reframed through the lens of European governance, economy, and religion. It's here the irony deepens. Because the colony of Delaware, this land renamed after a man who never knew it, would eventually become the first to break from the very system that gave it that name. The first state to declare allegiance to a new nation. The first to ratify the U.S. Constitution. The first to step into independence. But it did so while still bearing the name of an English baron, a name rooted not in liberty, but in monarchy. The foundation of freedom, branded with the signature of empire. A contradiction that runs deeper than most know, because when Delaware cast its vote for independence, it did so not under its original name, not under Lenape-Wahitic, not under any indigenous or local identity, but under the shadow of a colonial title that had already overridden what came before. It would be remembered as a pioneer of the Republic. But few would question why the first state of a new, free country still carried the name of a man who served the British Crown. Fewer still would ask what names were buried in the soil before Delaware rose in their place. The irony of independence, in December 1787, Delaware made history. It became the first state to ratify the United States Constitution. The first to say yes to a new nation. The first to step away from a monarchy and toward a republic built on liberty, self-rule, and freedom from colonial power. It was a moment of pride. A moment taught in textbooks and etched into national memory. But there's something strange, something unspoken, about that moment. Because the first state of a free America did so under a name it inherited from the British aristocracy, Delaware. Not a native name. Not a name chosen by its people. But the name of a man born into English nobility, a baron, a colonial governor. A symbol of the very monarchy that the colonies had just fought a war to escape. It's a contradiction that sits quietly in the background of American history. While patriots shed British rule and declared independence from kings, lords, and titles, they kept the names those powers left behind. They tore down statues, burned royal seals, rewrote laws, but they didn't always change the labels that defined the land. Delaware is not alone in this. Across the map, colonial names remain stitched into the geography of a country built on rebellion. But Delaware is different, because it was first to ratify, first to believe in a new identity, first to embrace the ideals of democracy, yet still carrying the name of a man who ruled by birthright, not by ballot. A man who never lived here, never spoke to the people, never saw the forests, the rivers, or the fields. A man whose name simply floated across the Atlantic and landed on a river and stayed there. The founders were building something radical. A government by the people, for the people. But the soil they built it on still whispered the names of those they were trying to forget. And no one seemed to notice. Maybe they were too busy forging a constitution. Maybe the name felt too familiar to question. Maybe erasure had already done its job. But it's worth asking, how does a revolution carry the name of the system it overthrew? Delaware stood at the front of the line for independence. It lit the match that set the framework of a new country ablaze with possibility. But that flame also cast shadows, shadows of a past that was never fully reckoned with. A past that renamed rivers, redefined borders, and redrew the map without asking who was already here. So when we celebrate Delaware as the first, as the bold, as the birthmark of the American experiment, we also have to sit with the irony. That independence was declared under a name given by empire, and that name still remains. Which brings us to the question no one ever asks, the question that lingers long after the ink has dried on declarations and constitutions. What does it mean when a free nation still calls itself by the names of the people it broke away from? So what's in a name? Sometimes, everything. A name can honor, a name can erase. It can carry memory, or bury it. Delaware, our first state, stands as a symbol of American independence. Yet its name echoes from across an ocean, tied not to freedom, but to aristocracy, to empire, to a man who never walked its soil. It's more than irony. It's a reminder that even as we broke from the crown, we kept the crown's language. Even as we claimed liberty, we carried names that were never ours to begin with. The river still flows. The people remain. But the names, those stay, long after the stories fade. And maybe it's time we ask ourselves, what names have we forgotten? Whose voices were drowned out? And what would it mean to speak them again? Because knowing the truth behind a name isn't just history, it's responsibility. If this story made you see Delaware, or any name on the map, a little differently, don't let it stop here. Share this video with someone who loves history. Drop a comment. Should places named after colonizers be changed? Subscribe for more hidden stories behind the names we take for granted. Because understanding where we are starts with knowing how we got here.